in the heart of the Indian Ocean. Far from the trade winds and bustling ports of the 18th century world, lies a tiny speck of land barely large enough to be called an island, scorched by the sun, devoid of fresh water, vegetation, or Tromelin Island is a place that seems purpose-built to test the limits of human endurance. No trees grow there, no streams run through it. The sands burn during the day and freeze in the night. And yet, in 1761, it became the unintended home of 60 forgotten souls captives, whose story would be buried under centuries of silence. This is the story of survival in its rawest form. It is a tale not of triumph, but of endurance. 15 years of unimaginable hardship, hunger, thirst, hope, and despair, all unfolding on a patch of coral in the middle of nowhere. It begins not on Tromelin Island itself, but in the bustling ports of French colonial trade, where profit often outweighed humanity and ships were packed with human cargo destined for lives of forced labor. The French ship Luteil, which ironically means the useful, set sail in 1761 from Bayonne, France. Its mission, officially, was military, a voyage to supply troops stationed in the Indian Ocean, but greed sailed alongside duty. The captain, Jean de Lafargue, had a secret and illegal. He intended to profit by smuggling enslaved Malagasy people from Madagascar to be sold on the French-controlled islands of the Indian Ocean, including French law forbade this particular form of slave trading in the region. But like many before him, Lafargue cared little for the law or the fate of those shackled below deck. On board were nearly 150 French sailors and soldiers, and more than 160 Malagasy men, women, and children, held in the ship's dark hold. The voyage was already perilous. The Indian Ocean is infamous for its treacherous coral reefs and sudden storms. Yet Lafargue, ignoring both weather warnings and maritime maps, chose a faster, more dangerous route. That decision would prove catastrophic. On the night of July 31, 1761, under cover of darkness, Luteil struck the reefs surrounding Tromelin Island. The ship shattered against the jagged coral. Its hull ripped open. Chaos erupted. French crew members scrambled for safety, while those imprisoned Baluchin together screamed in panic. Some drowned instantly. Others were crushed. But miraculously, many Malagasy captives survived, along with most of the crew. When morning came, the survivors found themselves on a tiny, barren island, barely 1 square kilometer in size. Their ship lay in pieces on the reef. The ocean stretched endlessly in all directions. There were no trees, no fresh water sources, and no natural shelter. The sun beat down with merciless intensity. It was a place unfit for human habitation, and yet it would become the home of these castaways for days, weeks, and ultimately, years. In the aftermath of the wreck, the French officers took control. They gathered what supplies they could from the wreckage and barrels of food, a few casks of water, tools, and timber. With no time to waste, they began constructing a small vessel using parts of the Luteil in a desperate bid to escape and seek help. The Malagasy survivors, despite their status as captives, worked alongside the French sailors. They helped build the makeshift ship, believing that once help was found, they too would be rescued. But when the vessel was completed, only the French crew and a handful of officers were allowed to board. The captain promised to return for them. He even left a written statement, etched on parchment, buried in a bottle beneath a stone, an official record of his vow to return. And then they left. They never came back. What followed was not just abandonment, it was betrayal. The ocean that had once carried them now became their prison, and the promises made to them dissolved with the tides. For most people, survival under these conditions for even a few days would seem impossible. But the Malagasy did not give up. They organized themselves, they scavenged the island, salvaged metal and wood from the wreck, and constructed rudimentary shelters using ship debris and coral stones. Fresh water was their greatest need. There were no springs, no wells, just rainfall, and that was rare. They created ingenious water traps and collectors from salvaged metal and canvas. Whenever the sky offered a gift of rain, they scrambled to gather every drop. When there was no rain, they rationed water with severe discipline. Thirst became a constant companion. Food was another struggle. There were no trees, no edible plants, but the sea provided small mercy. They caught birds, turtles, and fish, fashioning nets and traps with what little they had. Despite the harsh environment, they survived, day after day, year after year. Children were born and raised on the island, having never known a world beyond the endless sea. Time blurred. Days turned into months, Months into years, the survivors held on, hoping each sunrise might bring sails on the horizon. A ship, a rescue. But no ship came. The world had forgotten them. In 1773, 12 years after the wreck, a French ship appeared in the distance. The few remaining survivors lit signal fires and waved desperately. The ship came closer, but inexplicably, it never landed. It sailed away, leaving the islanders in disbelief. Whether the ship's crew feared disease or simply lacked orders to intervene remains unclear. But for those still clinging to life on Tromelin, it was another wounding reminder that their lives meant little to those who once called them cargo. Then, in 1776, 15 years after they had been abandoned, another vessel approached the island. This time, salvation came. Captain Jacques-Marie de Tromelin, for whom the island would later be named, landed with a rescue party. What he found was astonishing. Of the original 60 Malagasy survivors, only 7 women and 1 infant child remained. 15 years of hunger, disease, exposure, and heartbreak had taken their toll. And yet these 8 human beings had done the impossible. They had survived not just nature, but neglect. They had endured one of the most severe tests of human spirit ever recorded. Captain Tromelin took the survivors aboard his ship and brought them to more. They were no longer treated as slaves. In the years that followed, their story would slowly emerge fragmented, often silenced, rarely taught in schools or remembered in public. But it was real. Their survival was not just a testament to resilience, but a damning indictment of colonial cruelty and human disregard. For centuries, Tromelin Island remained mostly unvisited. Its harsh terrain discouraged settlement. Yet archaeological expeditions in recent decades have uncovered evidence of the survivors' lives: carefully built stone shelters, metal tools, remains of pots used for cooking, and even makeshift utensils fashioned from shipwreck debris. These relics whisper the story of a people who refused to vanish quietly. The tale of Tromelin Island is more than a shipwreck. It is the story of promises broken and hope undying. It is about how the discarded and forgotten fought for each breath, not in defiance of nature, but in defiance of man's inhumanity. And as the waves still lap against that lonely island's shore, their legacy remains etched in the coral, sand, and why not as slaves, not as victims, but as survivors. In recent years, calls have been made to memorialize the Tromelin survivors, to officially recognize their suffering and resilience. France has acknowledged the tragedy, but the tale still lives mostly in the shadows of history books. In schools, few children learn about them. In museums, their story is a footnote, if mentioned at all. But in the silence of that desolate island, their memory endures. It reminds us that history is not just the story of conquerors and kings, but of those who were cast aside and yet endured. The Malagasy survivors of Tromelin did not have armies, riches, or power, but they had will, community, and the most essential form of resistance: survival. For 15 years, on an island without shade, without trees, without mercy, they lived. And in doing so, they refused to be forgotten.